Well, good evening, everyone. Let's make a start, shall we? Thank you so much for being here for what I know will be a very interesting conversation on a topic that's been very much on people's minds. That is the surge of right-wing populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And tonight we'll look particularly at the use of religious rhetoric and religious imagery in right-wing populist movements in North America and in Europe. Well, it's a great privilege to have two expert speakers to address us and engage with us on this topic tonight. I was going to say to the far right is just directionally is Dr. Alex Goelach, who is a visiting fellow at Crash this term here in Cambridge. He's an affiliate professor at the Defense of Democracy program at Harvard, where he's been based most recently. He's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Very nice to have you with us, Dr. Goelach. And then to my also right, but not quite as far, is right here in the middle, the center, is Tobias Cremer, who is a graduate research associate here at Cyrus at Clare and a PhD student at Populism based at Peterhouse. He holds previous degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, and Sciences Po. So the way we thought we would format the evening is have each of our speakers give a sort of 15 to 20 minute overview, with Alex giving us sort of more of a 30,000 foot view, Tobias giving us a couple of case studies, particularly US and Germany. Then we'll have a chance for the two speakers to engage in conversation with one another, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the audience. We'll have altogether about 90 minutes, and I'm sure we won't want for things to discuss during that time. So. Welcome to all of you, welcome to our speakers, and we'll start with Dr. Goelach.
Thank you, Chad. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming and engaging with us on this topic. Let's dive into it. I would say we are in the midst of what I call an age of identity. And what does this mean? We find at this point in all angles of the planet, which we shall explore in a bit, a strive for identity to answer the questions who we are and what is the purpose of it all. And it is mostly this sort of endeavor and search comes in an us versus them form. Let's just go from east to west to explore what I mean. You look into the People's Republic of China nowadays, and you have a high emphasis of the Communist Party on the Confucian identity of the country, combined with an emphasis on the racial background of the Han Chinese. So if you today go to China and you talk about, let's say, democracy, then you will be hearing very often, like, that's great for you people in the West, but we have Confucius as a tradition with meritocracy and other elements that you may have in democracy. And we also have our own rich and long-standing Han Chinese heritage. You just go next door to India and you have a Hindu nationalist government running the show at this point, with Mr. Modi being obviously and openly highlighting what he calls the Hindu essence or nature of India. So you have this sort of this goes right at the Muslim minority in the country, which consists of 200 million people. So that's quite a large minority. However, you have this very much fueled nationalist, religiously loaded sort of rhetoric. Just recently, there has been a college in Delhi. This example is directed to the Christian minority, where this college has a chapel, and somebody a group of people had put graffiti on it and saying we built a temple here and all this kind of stuff. Of course, this created an outrage with especially the alumni community of this college. But however, it gives you a slight touch of what I mean by age of identity when we come from China, and now we have this example of India. Same goes for Russia and Turkey. And it's worthwhile to check on all these examples in particular, because it gives you an array, and then I can talk about what they have in common. But you have the Russian narrative of being non-Western and labeling the West as decadent. And this also follows basically a pattern that is known already from the 19th century onwards, where Russia, had this debate about whether or not being a part of the West or being something of its own. Turkey, I guess many of you are aware of the political situation here, where President Erdogan is reinvigorating the great Ottoman past of the country, and also by his foreign policy style in the Middle East, also trying to impose or expose, if you will, this assertion, this belief in the grandeza of the Turkish Ottoman nation. So these have all been either non-democracies or fading democracy, whatever. But if you look into the heartland of what we call Western democracy, you find, and that's what Toby's gonna highlight later, in almost every European country you find a similar rhetoric and narratives that highlight Europe as a Christian continent and the countries therein as Christian countries. This is to a higher degree, let's say in Poland and Hungary, in a lesser but still very measurable degree in Germany, where you would say this is us, our essence is being Christian, and it's basically directed against the Muslim minority in Europe and immigrants of Muslim faith. Same goes for England with the Brexit and the United States with the election of Donald Trump and what came with it. But even to leave that out, because that's also Toby's domain, you just go a bit south, and that's my last example. You go south of the United States and you have Mexico sharing a 3,000 kilometers border with the United States, and they have a presidential election. It's a democracy, but it started to become a democracy basically just 20 years ago when the reigning party, which reigned after the revolution in the 1920s, was just voted out of office, and then they started let's say with the opposition having in the PAN party and Vicente Fox, the first president in the year 2000. So now they have also a populist running for the highest office as a president, who then let's say motivated or inspired by Donald Trump himself now gathered a anti-American rhetoric, and he seems to be winning the race. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador is the guy's name. So you basically have a global array from democracies to non-democracies, in dictatorships and in fading democracies. You have a reassessment and a rebirth, if you will, of identity-driven politics. So this is not an isolated event. So, and why I say that is also because these countries, this is not the 19th or 18th century anymore. These countries are connected by the internet and by media consumption. I lived in Taiwan the last year, and I had also an assignment at the university in Hong Kong. The moment Catalonia had this referendum, and we do not discuss now the legal quality of this, but just having a step towards what some would call independence, people in Hong Kong and Taiwan were triggered saying, oh wow, that's great, that's good for our cause. And I spent months telling them that's just a different case. But I'm just saying this global connectivity also connects populists and people of that kind of sort. So this age of identity, you can really see comes along from China to Mexico, and this is in particular a challenge, if you will, if not a threat to institutions like this university or journalism or academia in per se. And why is that? Because in an us versus them rhetoric, which comes in let's say in a populist fashion, the populism in itself is not an ideology. It can be a left-wing or a right-wing populism. Obviously that's what you find in the definition, but what you find in the definition is that you have an outer and an inner enemy that you need to tackle in order to make the will of the people come true. And if you look globally, it's always the elites. I mean, it's always the elites, but today it's labeled as the globalist or the liberal elites, which mostly constitutes in journalists and media people. You can see that they are persecuted or offended in all the countries that I mentioned to higher or lower degrees. But that also makes this populist movement, plural, kind of a singular movement, because if they connect even closer, they may realize and they all have singled out the same enemy, if you will, or the same other, and that I think happens for the first time in history, this degree of connectivity. So let us dive into the reasons why this happens. And I couldn't help the very a book that I never really was fond of, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And there's so much to be criticized about it still, but I just recently had a discussion with a student of mine, and he said well, but look, nowadays, 20 years, 25 years later, we talk about the Chinese culture, the Turks talk about the Turkish culture, the Europeans talk about the European culture. So it's not Huntington coming true in that sense, at least, that we do not define ourselves by the nation state we live in, but by the cultural hemisphere that we say we are a part of. And I'd say, well, that's quite a fair assessment, but that's not where we will be going down, but just as a food for thought. So if we look into the reasons for this development, we come across the buzzwords of digitalization and globalization, and it's the question whether or not they help us really to assess all the things that just now happen. But I alluded also to the fact that the connectivity, the global connectivity, is quite a driver for this age of identity, if we want. So let's look into some people who have given a thought about this us versus them rhetoric and pattern, if you want, and why that is. Maybe some of you have heard of Yuval Harari. It's an Israeli historian who came up with a book a few years ago called Homo Sapiens, and then just a recent book is Homo Deus. So I think that's a bit too fantastic, but the first book, Homo Sapiens, he laid something out what I think is quite compelling. He said, we run on narratives, and these narratives of identity, as I'd call them, he has two types of them, and one is gossip, and the other is myth or religion. And he'd say the moment humans come about to learn, they have to tackle a task which cannot be tackled within family, kin. He would argue you need a story, a narration, a narrative that makes you collaborate on this, be it hunting a mammoth or whatever. He says the moment humans need to collaborate, they need also a narrative. So he very much digs this or connects this with let's say the very essence of human civilization. And so there is this one, in a group, you just need to talk about things that just happen on a casual day, have you heard about this, and that this one got drunk, this one slept with that one, or whatever. So that's the gossip part to make people just get connected. And the other is then the religious mythological part to just say where do we come from, and what is this all about? What is the purpose of our hunting the mammoth, or is there something more to it? And I think that's something that very deeply connects to what we see in this us versus them identity age. So in regard to now globalization and digitalization, what's different to other ages of identity? Another author helps us. It's Alvin Toffler, and he wrote a book quite 50 years ago. It's called The Future Shock, and you can sum up the relevance of this book for us with just a short remark. He said there is times of technological progress in which the acceleration is so strong, the speed is so high, that even elites in society may not be capable of following up with it. And that's followed by a certain uncertainty and not even fear in societies, that you may be overrun by the technological progress. And one could argue we are living in such an age, or we are just about to enter this age of AI and automatization, where many old certainties may vanish, and even the elites, if you call academia or journalists or politicians, all these sort of explainers and actors in society may be too overwhelmed with these events, and that is something that Toffler would assert. So, but that's still does it really explain enough why we have this us versus stemming, this teaming up in groups? And so the social behavior theory, which came about in the 70s, 80s of the last century by people like Teifel and Taylor, they have a very, I think, scary result in their studies. So they had children, and in these experiments, the children would play in a team against another team. So far so good, but the children did not meet anyone in their team nor the other. and they could like measure and realize that the children would show strong solidarity to their own team, even though they wouldn't be like knowing anyone in the team. And their conclusion was like this, like the wish to belong to a group and like be part of that, and just also then have this what Harari would call like the common task. Like in this case it's a game, but in the Harari case it's hunting a mammoth. That seems to also be very like deeply ingrained in like identity like development, and so that's kind of another element to it. And the last person that I wish really to remember in this context is a French philosopher going by the name René Girard, and he's basically like on top of all this us versus them explaining in his like scapegoating theory why this us versus them almost always inevitably leads into conflict and leads basically into war or Holocaust or whatever you want to call it, the disasters that can come about. But for him this has a mechanism that very much is connected to what I mentioned earlier about globalization, digitalization, and the velocity of progress nowadays. So what does he say? He says like, oh, this is like a nice river and there's a nice valley. Why don't this one group, this tribe says, oh, let's settle there. That's awesome here. So a few years later, another tribe comes along and says, oh, that's a very pretty goddamn spot. That's awesome. We want to settle there too. Then the others say, no, we're already here. So, and that's something that he would say would create a scarcity amongst like these two groups. And there's maybe another group coming and another one. And in the end, this imitation of the second, the third, and the fourth group of the first one may be inevitably lead to an armed conflict by which these groups need a scapegoat in order to redeem their conflict. So what the guy did, he was looking into all ancient like mythology and stories and narratives, and say it comes always down to the scapegoat. So there needs in his conclusion is there is a need for the redeeming quality of the peace treaty, if you will. After you had like this huge conflict, in the end you always will be needing a scapegoat that you cast out in the desert or like basically kill. And what I find compelling about this in a sense is like that it describes scarcity. And if we are in a time of uncertainty, and people not really sure about the future of economy and the future of our resources and the future of the climate and whatever, it also creates a scarcity. And this is something that we have to take in account, that this may be like an alleged scarcity. There may be still enough food for everybody on the planet, but this retrieving to the tribal system seems to be like to prepare for the time of scarcity in this Girard model. And also this is something, by the way, that also Huntington would write in his book by saying like he will be seeing like a tribalism in economy. And that's also something that we see nowadays. We have like this retrieval from international trading treaties, for instance, and we see it not only in the Trump example, you see it in many other regards too. So it's interesting to look at that. So that's like maybe the consequence of this alleged scarcity that drives is the trigger of this age of identity. And if it's so, then actually we have real problem at hand, because according to Girard and all these others, it's very much like ingrained in how we humans work. It's not necessarily, I mean, I do not believe in something like a human nature or whatever from a philosophical, metaphysical standpoint, but it seems to be like in the Girard context, who is basically a metaphysicist. But I think what we can take from it is that it seems to be like a learned sort of like problem solving, if you will. So there has been the longer period in history, you resolved your problems by killing each other rather than negotiating. And it seems to be like coming back in this age of identity. And it comes with religion, to just mention this, like, because that's also why we're here. It's interesting, Max Weber, in his sociology of religion, he obviously classifies types of religion. And when he speaks about archaic religion, and it's like basically your cattle is sick, do you call the veterinarian or the priest? Do you call for medicine or for blessed water? And it's like in the sense like when you do not know, when things are very uncertain in this Max Weber framework, people tend to like the easy answer, of superstition. That's what he would say. And now we keep on saying populism means people just turning to the easier answer. And that seems to be very much connected to what Weber says about primitive forms, if I can use the term, of religion, because it comes as a response to uncertainty, and you follow with like quite a set of unlogical, if you will, practices by which you hope to achieve your scope, like that your kettle gets well again. And as a last point, like how do we tackle this? And that's just a thought. But I keep on like, what has changed? When you look into what has changed, and people then speak about the order after the Second World War, which is very collaborative and international. We have created international institutions like the United Nations, and there's supranational entities like the European Union. I think all this development after the war, in my opinion, has been triggered by something that comes very handy, like in one photo, in one work of art, even, if you will, and you all do know it. So usually if you had a PowerPoint, you would show it, but that would just totally miss the point, because I want you to have this photo now all in your heads. And it's called Earthrise, and it's the first photo ever been taken of this planet from out of space. And this happened in '68, which already was like a very like popular year when it comes to change and whatnot. But I'd say like this photo and what came with it triggered, and that's provable like in social sciences, triggered like peace movements and environmental movements, because it came with the rhetoric, look, this is such a sweet tiny blue/green planet, we all live on it, you don't see borders from outer sky, you also don't see like religion and blood and whatever, so why the heck do we not just get our act together? But I mean, this sounds so like maybe even pathetic or cheesy or whatever, but it had the capacity of overcome old narratives of division, if you will. And that was basically, you had the experience of the Second World War, the Shoah, and the hundreds of millions of dead people, but then coming like not only this necessity, but also having science jumping in and telling us like that this is just like a very unique place we live in. And I think this triggered lots of what we know as inclusiveness. So when I was a kid in the 80s in Germany, you would learn like to say like there's enough food at some point. I mean, if we just make it right, everybody will have food. So there was no, I mean, it's never been the case, but like you believed in the possibility, and you believed that there is a chance. So that it was basically not an age where you would define yourself through scarcities and saying like, oh my God, no, we cannot give like food to those because then we will be starving. But I think we have been entering a time which has been exploited by populists through their rhetoric of nation and religion, where people may be thinking that we are again in such a mode and in such an era. So I'd say like if you look into this Earthrise photo, you find a new addition, like the 20th century, 21st century ideal of cosmopolitanism. And when Theresa May recently said, who is home everywhere has no home, it's just like the saddest thing she could have said, because that's just like not what cosmopolitanism is about. It's about like realizing you have a home that you love, and then everybody else also has a home that he or she loves. But it's triggering like a global sense of empathy. And that has been coming unto us from the ancient philosophers from Greece and Rome, to just say like cosmopolitanism is something that triggers empathy for the other. And now the things what we have to tackle, be it global migration or climate change, is only be solvable in the context of this cosmopolitanism that triggers empathy. So far from my end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goelach, and straight over to you, Tobias.
Well, thanks a lot, Judd, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks, Alex, for setting us up so very well. And yeah, actually, as Judd mentioned, Alex and I actually know each other from Harvard times, and I was just thinking with my plastic mug of water that the last time we saw each other, I think, was at the speakers conference at Harvard. Yeah. And I leaned over to you and said, and it was like very Puritan, classic Harvard plastic mugs and plastic cutlery, and I leaned over and said, like, at least when it comes to wining and dining, the old Cambridge still is somewhat ahead of the Cambridge of the Massachusetts spin-off. So I'm very glad that seems to have struck a nerve with you, and we could lure you back to the true and original. Yeah. But to jump straight into the topic as well, as Judd mentioned, I'm going to be very much focusing on the religion side. and in particular in Western democracies. I normally have 4 case studies: US, Germany, France, and Britain. I'm going to focus particular on the US and Germany today. But before getting into the nitty-gritty of the subject, let me actually start by taking you onto a little journeys through a couple of European cities in the last few years. And let's just start this journey in Dresden, Germany, Germany's capital of Baroque. And imagine you're walking through this beautiful city of Dresden. You come across this huge crowd of people, a couple of thousands, maybe even 10,000, who are gathering around the Frauenkirche, the main church in Dresden. And a lot of them are singing church hymns, a couple of them are carrying candles, some oversized crosses. And then imagine we take the train and we're going to Paris. And again, we're walking through the beautiful streets of Paris, and we come across another crowd of people. Again, a couple of thousand people, this time gathering around the statue of a Catholic saint to prepare to march through the streets of Paris in that saint's veneration. And then imagine we take the plane, we go to the US, to Florida, and we come across yet another crowd of people, again a couple of thousand activists, and they start their gathering by reciting the Lord's Prayer and singing God Bless the USA. Now what is interesting about these 3 events, all of which took place within the last 2 years, is that none of them actually took place in the context of a religious service, a religious procession, or any other kind of religious gathering, but they were all organized by right-wing populists. The first by Pegida in Dresden, the second by the Front National at their annual gathering on the 1st of May in Paris, and the third is a Trump rally in Florida. And these events are actually somewhat representative of 2 broader trends. One is that you already mentioned, the rise of right-wing populism, and then secondly, the surge of, or the increased reference to religion in public discourse again. And given the events, or the way the events presented themselves to us, one may be very tempted to see both trends as part of the same backlash against the advance of liberalism, as Pippa Norris at Harvard put it, or put them on the same side of a new culture war between secularism, Christianity, and Islam, as Kilpatrick put it. However, the point that I'm going to try and make today is that, as tempting as such an interpretation may seem, particularly to the secular mind, when we look at the data, when we look a bit closer, reality actually looks far more nuanced than that. So if we look to the US, we do see, yes, Trump did get 81% of the evangelical vote, which is even more than Romney, and I think he even beat George W. Bush in that. But then what is interesting is that the same evangelicals also perceived him as the least religious GOP candidate in recent history. And you actually saw that there was, during the primaries, quite significant opposition by evangelical clergy that usually tends to be quite conservative. And maybe, Judd, you can later in the discussion maybe say something about that, because Judd's father was actually involved in a recent gathering of evangelical leaders in the US that was discussing this association between Trumpism and evangelicalism, put this to an extent into question. And if we look to Europe, we also see that although a lot of right-wing populist parties are using more and more Christian symbols, their supporters actually tend to be disproportionately irreligious. So if you look, for instance, to Germany, the AfD scores about double as high amongst irreligious voters than amongst Protestants and Catholics, and that is true throughout Europe. So actually things like church attendance is one of the strongest predictors for not voting right-wing populists. And if we take the example from Dresden, actually, it's really quite interesting. They did a survey at one of the demonstrations, where there were recurring demonstrations, basically the same theme, and they asked a couple of hundred people, just like generally about their background. And it turned out that only half a dozen of them actually identified as Christian. So all these people with the oversized crosses actually identified, I think over 90% identified as atheists when asked in the survey. So how can we explain this paradoxical expression of the relationship between right-wing populism and religion? Basically, what I'm going to try and do in this talk is to proceed in 4 steps. It's first looking at the social origins of right-wing populism, in particular, putting this in the context of this new identity politics. Second, to look at how religion fits into this, how it could be used in this context. Third, look at how the strategy actually works out in practice. And then fourth, to maybe contemplate the question what that may mean for the role of the church in politics and society in the 21st century. So first things first, the social roots of right-wing populism. Basically, it's going to play in a similar direction as Alex, that right-wing populism in Western democracies is to a large extent the consequence of the emergence of a new identity cleavage. And maybe as a quick background for those who are not sociologists and don't know social cleavages refer to the main social divides within society that shape and define the political systems and the parties that populate it. And traditionally in the West we had two main social cleavages. On the one hand we basically had the economic cleavage between the working class and the capitalists, or between protectionism and free trade. You can call it the class struggle if you want to. And then on the other hand we had the religious or moral cleavage between social conservatives, often associated with the church on the one hand, and on the other hand, social liberals often associated with secularism. And you can map most traditional parties very well on this matrix. Interestingly, though, it's much more difficult when it comes to right-wing populists. So when you look at right-wing populists, they actually turn up on both ends of the economic side. We have a lot of neoliberal right-wing populists, but we also have quite a lot of more economically left-wing. If we think about the Front National in France, very much pro-welfare, even when we think of Trump and his entire rhetoric about protectionism. And you have actually, maybe surprisingly, similarly, when they are not that easily located on the religious cleavage either, on the moral cleavage either. Because yes, you have quite a lot of, one could say, reactionary rhetoric amongst right-wing populists, but then you also have quite a lot of right-wing populists who do at least style themselves. The question whether this is true, to what extent this works in policy is another one, but who stylize themselves as the real defender of secularism, as the real defender of gay rights, as the real defender of feminism. You have that, for instance, with the FN or Gerd Wilders, who are very, very vocal on that, and who say, like, we are the real defenders of these secular values against radical Islam. And interestingly, right-wing populists therefore don't seem to be really defined on their core in these. They can oscillate between those. So very much agreed with Alex. I think it looks like there's actually a new cleavage, a new social cleavage emerging in Western societies that is more about identity. So how do we define us and the other? It's very much the question of, like, on the one hand you have the cosmopolitans, the globalists, the universalists, whatever you may want to call them. And on the other hand, you have, you said us versus them, others say it's nativism. I personally, sometimes such words are a bit loaded. I personally quite like what the words David Goodhart used in his book, between the somewheres and the anywheres. So the somewheres being much more traditionalist, communitarian in their ideas of identity, whereas the anywheres are much more universalist and individualist about that. And then interestingly, on this cleavage, most mainstream parties are actually very much on the cosmopolitan side, at least officially, or at least until very recently, with New Labour, for instance, throughout Europe and the social democratic parties, but also relatively socially liberal conservative parties nowadays. Whereas this area is very much empty; it's a vacuum, and this is where right-wing populists try to get their votes from. Now the question is, how does religion fit into this? And basically, the thing is, it's about identity, and you have to, as you said, right-wing populists' worldview, I think, is very much in a triangle. So yes, you have on the one hand you have the pure people, the homogeneous people. These are the good guys. And then you have two evil guys. You have on the one hand the internal enemy, that's the elite, the corrupt elite, and then you have the external other. This is primarily for right-wing populists. You have the external other, that's the external enemy. And what we see in Europe, and increasingly also in the US, is that this other is increasingly defined in religious terms. There are different hypotheses about why that is, whether it's because of immigration, whether it's because of radical Islamic terrorism or whatever, but most studies show that the other is increasingly defined in religious terms and very often as Islam. So it's very often a very Islamophobic idea of worldview to this extent. And then as the other is defined in identity, analogously, one may think, well, then the us could be also defined in religious terms, and therefore Christianity may actually come in quite useful. But what is interesting about this is that in this respect, right-wing populists use Christianity, but not necessarily as a faith, but much rather as a cultural context. They speak of Christendom rather than Christianity. And it is actually quite interesting to see that instead of following the teaching of the church in public policy, they actually marry the usage of Christian symbols, Christian language, etc., to very secular policies, because they very often come from a very secular tradition, often a paganist or anti-Christian tradition, and they don't actually change their policies in this. They just cover it to an extent with religious rhetoric. So what we see to an extent here is the dissociation of belief and belonging, of religion as a faith, from religion as a cultural identifier. To maybe make this a bit more palpable, this is very much the example of the Front National venerating the Catholic saint Joan of Arc, in spite of its own anti-clerical positions on laicite, and in spite of its own positions, for instance, in favor of gay marriage. They didn't participate in the Manif pour tous, for instance. It's similar to Pegida's carrying of crosses around Dresden, in spite of its secular followership, and Geert Wilders' increased reference to the Netherlands Judeo-Christian culture, in spite of his own professed atheism, and basically rebuttal of the church's teaching on basically all topics you could probably think of. And if we think of this idea of Christianity as a cultural identifier, not necessarily as a faith, it even may make sense to have a twice divorced, thrice remarried, formerly pro-choice businessman with somewhat limited biblical knowledge, or at least exhibited biblical knowledge, but several alleged extramarital affairs, becoming the savior of Christian America. In this respect, it may actually make sense of Christian America as a cultural term, not a religious one. So in some, right-wing populist policies are often, some might say, Christian in a cultural sense. Some may even say Christian only to the extent that they're anti-Muslim. So how does this strategy then work out in practice? And here's actually quite interesting that we see that it's most successful amongst irreligious people or non-practicing Christians, whereas practicing Christians remain comparatively immune to such appeals. So I already mentioned a couple of statistics, so I won't go into that again, but this is very much confirmed by the literature. So you actually have, for instance, Montgomery and Winters calling it a religion gap in the voting of right-wing populism, and Alzheimer and Immersel even speak of a vaccination effect of Christian practice against voting right-wing populism. And we had the German example and the Italian, and then the same is true if you look into France and Italy, that Catholic churchgoers are amongst those who vote the Front National Liga Nord the least. And even in the US it's quite interesting, because yes, you do have 81% of white evangelicals voting Trump, and he did do really well there for himself, but if you actually break it down, he did spectacularly well amongst those white evangelicals who don't go to church, whereas he somewhat underperformed amongst those who attend services quite regularly. So the question is a bit: do we really see a sacralization of American politics through white evangelicals, or do we rather see, to an extent, a secularization of what used to be called the Christian right in America? And some social scientists have gone so far to say that there's actually a schism of right-wing voters between, on the one hand, a traditional, more or less religious right that is more composed of church-going, more educated middle class that remains committed to most of the church teaching on social conservatism, but is, for instance, open to immigration and attached to conservative parties, to traditional conservative parties. And on the other hand, a new, more secular, to an extent, nativist right that seems to appeal more to working class voters and combines secular values with cultural nativism and authoritarian tendencies, and is less attached to church teaching or traditional conservative parties. So overall, we see here that religion may play to some extent, maybe a fuel to right-wing populism in some ways, in a cultural sense, but may actually also work as quite an impressive barrier to right-wing populism. So what does this mean for instance, for the question of the role of the church, of the institution of the church in society? And here I really go, I take the German-American case studies maybe as like a starting point of discussion, because it looks like that by either condoning or challenging right-wing populist use of religious rhetoric and symbols, churches may have a significant impact on the success or electoral success of these parties. So if you look, for instance, in Germany, where the churches have come out relatively strongly against right-wing populism, you see that this vaccination effect actually holds quite strongly, especially amongst church-going Christians, but also amongst a lot of cultural Christians who don't necessarily practice anymore. And this is actually quite noteworthy because we see both Pegida and the AfD initially very much try to break with the far-right tradition of anti-Christian rhetoric and to be an alternative for Christians, Alternative für Christen. And the churches initially weren't too opposed to it. But when it became clear that anti-immigration policies very much remained at the core of these movements, the German churches came out quite strongly against their use of religious themes, and they called them perverted, for instance. They made very public condemnations. They turned off cathedral lights in front of right-wing demonstrations. So when we think about Dresden, they actually turned off the light of the Frauenkirche in the background so they couldn't have nice pictures. And things like this, and thereby they became, to an extent, quite one of the most robust, I think, in the German public sphere, opponents of right-wing populism. And interestingly, you also saw that in the right-wing populist movements, you saw certain, some may say secularization, to the extent that, for instance, the AfD distanced itself from many of its earlier pro-church social conservative positions, and with, for instance, the AfD's leader, Alexander Gauland, declaring that the AfD is not a Christian party in reaction to these actions of the churches. Whereas if we look in the US, it's really interesting that the church leaders who initially opposed Trump during the primaries have gone to an extent rather silent and seem to, with a certain level of teeth grinding, more or less loyally support Trump. This may, to an extent, I mean, it's really interesting to see this in the dynamic of the recent declaration of some evangelicals, but it may suggest that this, to an extent, legitimizes, or at least publicly legitimizes, white evangelicals' votes for Trump, that they aren't necessarily challenged, and therefore this immunization effect is much, much lower in the US. So instead of giving conclusions, I actually thought maybe just throwing out three questions we can maybe address later, but also just to think about it. And mainly the first question being whether the emergence of right-wing populism, is that really just a threat to democracy? Or maybe is it also corrective for an old party system that does not seem to represent this classical, this new social cleavage about identity anymore? Is religion primarily a fuel or a barrier to right-wing populism? And how does it work, and what could society do to push it one way or the other? And then finally, maybe more on the meta level, what does this mean for the future of faith in society or in the public sphere? Do we really see a sacralization of politics that we have to combat with more secularism? Or do we see rather a secularization of the sacred, which may require different sorts of actions? And what does this mean for instance, the role of the church and public? But I'll leave it with that and hand it back over to Judd.
Great. Thank you so much, Tobias, for a really rigorous talk. Lots to think about. Thank you again, Dr. Goelach, for your overview of the global situation. Let's thank both of our speakers, shall we? Now we have about 45 minutes for discussion. Now, Tobias quite helpfully finished with a couple of questions. I'm curious, Dr. Goelach, if you heard anything in his remarks, or if you want to take up those concluding questions that he posed. But anything you want to respond to Tobias, and likewise, Tobias, anything you heard from Dr. Goelach where you'd like to respond?
Well, I think it's very interesting what you say about secularism versus religiosity, if you will. You have these. I'm sure you're quite aware of it, but just like to throw that in, there was like in early January, there was like one of the main survey institutes, exactly on that, like a survey, and it says that it was like 68% of people saying, no, Germany is a Christian country, and it should also show this Christianness publicly, and I think 58% of the survey would even make stronger remarks about the Christianness. The church-going rate is down to 13%. So basically, you have this real kind of gap. That's just highlighting this again. But secularism, as I see it, is creating a language of, I would not even necessarily call it inclusiveness, but it's a language by which everybody can tune into societal discourses. So that's also like why being like the blame on liberal democracy, the main feature that makes a democracy liberal would also help like any empire to fly, which is just like the basic assertion that there is different opinions and you need to somehow address these different opinions, and you do just like have some means to express them in the public sphere. And like people like Habermas or Charles Taylor, they would just say like it's, or even like John Rawls with his theory of justice, they would become overlapping consensus. You have to create a space in society where all different, let's say, faith groups or interest groups can interact. And the tribalization of discourses by like super highlighting like the Christianness or the Hinduness or the Muslimness of it is actually exactly revoking that. So and like in the case of liberal democracy and what people or the government in Hungary or Mr. Orban in Poland and Mr. Orban in Hungary, they say no, we want an illiberal democracy. But I would just say like this is not going to work, because it's like it's just neglecting the very essence of democracy, acknowledging there is different opinions. And if you have like, I mean, there is a liberal democracy tries to make sense out of the rule of the majority and the rights of minorities. And if you take away like the rights of minorities, you only have the rule of the majority. And this is why like populist movements who speak for the people just turn out to become like, despoties and dictatorships.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tobias,
yeah, I mean, maybe very quickly on that, I very much agree with what you just said. Maybe I just think it's very interesting that in most arguments this doesn't necessarily come across for those who say like, we have like most arguments for secularism is not usually framed in the way of we have to find a space to talk to each other and everybody can articulate their religious beliefs. It very often comes through as these right-wing populists are Christian and then these Muslims are also kind of dangerous, so let's just ban religion entirely, which then actually allows right-wing populists to play on the fact that many cultural Christians don't necessarily, or that many people don't know a lot about Christian faith, really, but they see the remnants of the culture. And so we actually see, due to an extent, a lack of space for religion to communicate, or like just being banned from the public sphere, an increasing lack of knowledge about what religion is. And as a result, you can actually, it is actually quite impressive if you think about it, that right-wing populists, or that the claim of the churches over religion or the authority of the churches over Christianity has become so weak that right-wing populists can say, we are the real Christians. These churches are just like elitist people who have nothing to do with the faith. And that quite a lot of people buy into this. And it would be, I don't think, if people were much more aware about what it actually entails to be a Christian country, or like, for the church at least, it would be quite that easy to abuse them. The Christian churches in Germany are very much caught in between the people who say like, well, you're not Christian enough, but then they say, well, actually the very Christian thing is that we accept these foreigners in, and this is like Angela Merkel is not against the Christian side of it. So it's just, I think, very, very interesting that you have to see how, like, secularism, but how does this allow religion not just to be pushed away, and then extreme forces trying to claim, well, religion actually means that or this, and then you abuse it more in a political way. And maybe very quickly on the other thing you said between, well, to an extent that our liberalism and universalism is the true answer, and that on the other end of the cleavage, these people are just in general dangerous. I mean, I think I would probably locate myself also rather here, but then to an extent the question is, if there's a cleavage already, doesn't actually also mean that we also do us versus them, because we say, oh, we define ourselves through these others, through these somewheres, these right-wing populists, and don't they actually also have a certain claim to represent something? Isn't that a sign that something in our democracies may be not represented, that there is a social cleavage that is not represented? And you don't necessarily have to want right-wing populists to represent that, but maybe it is also a call for parties to say, well, maybe there is something to it, maybe there is a legitimacy for these people who think in these ways to be represented in a democracy.
Well, I have a number of questions I'd want to pose, but I think in the interest of time, let me open the floor to I see hands going up already, so I'll try to be as fair as I can. We'll just start here and kind of move across the room, if that's all right. The other Tobias.
Cool, thank you very much for this very fascinating and amazing canvas. The first question goes to Alex in terms of the age of identity. I was wondering, was there ever an age of non-identity? Kind of to what extent is that really new? If you think obviously about the 19th century and the nationalism, all the groupism and the totalitarian systems, the 20th century has seen, and kind of you seem to kind of carve out kind of the 70s, 80s as a moment of the globalist movement, but then there was kind of the Iranian Revolution happening at the same time. So wasn't there always, in a sense, a strong sense of identity, of community building? So I was like to push you on that. The second point is kind of what is then the other of identity? Kind of if it's the age of identity, what are the other problems and structures that are hidden? Maybe what are the struggles and the conflicts line that kind of get pushed in the background? And I think you alluded to kind of economic struggles sometimes. So do you have the feeling that there are certain actually groups on all sides that really benefit, that this is now the discourse of the day? So other maybe recruiting ground for, say, social movements or whatever, representing the little people that actually lose out. And the last question goes right to what Tobias just said. Kind of if they are the kind of the identitarians, the parochials, the kind of non-cosmopolitans, and we say, okay, we want this cosmopolitan spirit, isn't that exactly kind of reproducing a certain dichotomy as well? And is the other, like, how do we deal with that lack of representative of people that are not educated in Sciences Po, Harvard, and Cambridge, like that somehow, of course, as democracy, somehow we want to take into account. So how do we, what is our response to that if we want to rely on deliberative democracy, if we want to rely on cosmopolitanism and these liberal values?
So to the first of your questions, I think I do not subscribe to Hegel onwards, like, and Huntington kind of like, oh, there's like a scheme or a metric in history, so things repeat and whatever. So I guess like what makes you're right by your basic assumption, saying like this has repeated over time again and again, and also like fascism was like a connected like sort of movement in the 20th century. So was everything that paid out as real life communism. I mean, so but that we also saw this in the 20th century. What I think now, what makes it explicit or different is we see another phase of technological and therefore also economical like progress or acceleration. So this may be like more repeating something that happened in the mid-19th century, where like the acceleration in technological progress like led to very massive social changes, like people from the countryside to the cities, and the social question that was posed. So we may be being like in such a time economically, but I think it doesn't help us to know that we are a degree worse off than like last time or whatever. So that's the second thing I find quite compelling what you said, because I think it's not the when it comes against globalists and the rest or whatever, I think it's not necessarily how you are off nowadays economically, like the Pegida guys in that survey that Toby mentioned. They were asked about their like economic status, and let's say it's the same or even better than 10 years ago, but we are afraid it's not going to last. So you have this sort of like, the AfD in Germany, it's one of the richest countries on the planet, but you have like regions where there's 30% voting for the AfD. So that does not really objectively resemble the economic status. Not saying like that everything is gorgeous and great in Germany, but I'm just saying like, it's just like very disproportional in a sense. And very often it's like playing the elites, the politicians, they would be like disentangled or whatever they call it. But I think, if you ask me personally, I think there is a large divide. But I think this divide goes through people who wake up in the morning and not having options, and people waking up in the morning having options. And this is not just only like me saying this, like in a Cambridge college, sociologist Elias Canetti was already writing about this. He said like the position of power is the one of the standing man, because he can move like freely, and this moving free means like he has options. Whereas like the opponent, he may just have won over, is flat on the ground and lost. So, and what is the feature of being a loser in this context is you have lost less options of moving, and he observed this in native tribes and whatever. And I think this is like a divide that we see nowadays, that you have like people who feel they have options, and others who just feel they don't.
Yeah, quite agree on this. And very quickly to your question about what we do about the fact that that may actually be a divide, even if we don't want that to be a divide, because it goes against our worldview, or against a liberal worldview. Actually quite interesting. It's a bit what the German philosopher Carl Schmitt always said, that liberalism is actually the most crusading ideology, because it says, well, there is no other, and we are all universalists, and who disagrees is not even debatable. They're just outside of that. And I think as difficult as Carl Schmitt is, there is at least an essence of truth in that what we sometimes do, what a lot of liberals sometimes do, in vilifying everybody who is not liberal or universalist in this respect. And I think there may be worthwhile to just think about a differentiation between normative cosmopolitanism, that we say that people may say, well, we think cosmopolitanism or liberalism would be the best thing, and empirical cosmopolitanism, recognizing that not everybody thinks that, and that it's actually legitimate not to think that, and actually taking those who say, well, for me, what matters more are inherited identities, to take this more seriously, and also say, well, this is a valid form of identity. You don't have to just identify yourself through your through the things you have achieved, like you rose up between the classes, through your degrees, etc. But it may also be just a very valid form of identity for people to say, well, I have inherited this identity. I grew up in Stamford, and Stamford is my strong identity, and that is nothing to look down upon. I sometimes think a lot of liberals, especially in places like this or the other Cambridge, very much think like, well, poor people. But I think we have to recognize that this is just as valid as other forms of identity, and I think this may also then help to fight the narrative of victimization that many right-wing populists use very much, because they are actually in this, quite interesting. They are using a rhetoric that sounds very familiar from left-wing identity politics, of saying, well, we are the oppressed, we are the victims, and all we don't want to rule the world or rule the country. All we want is actually just to say our culture, it's ethno-pluralism, our culture has the right to just be the way it always used to be, and in reality we are oppressed by those liberals. And it's quite interesting, if you look at Trump's voters, 45% of Trump voters said they think whites in the US are disadvantaged and discriminated against. And if we start to actually say, well, it's you may have legitimate reason not to vilify people in the first place for having different forms of identity or having different ideas about liberalism, this victimization may also not be that effective anymore. But I mean, it's very difficult to then actually do that.
Can I say a word to Carl Schmitt, because that helps a lot, because Carl Schmitt wrote this tiny little booklet called Political Theology. So this tells a lot about, like, the whole framework we are discussing in. And I think he points out the very weakness of democracy, not necessarily liberal democracy, but democracy as such. And we see this nowadays in the discourses. He said, like, in a democracy, the administrative body is the decisive one, because that's just like where all the decision making or the rollout of decision making is going to happen. But it says nobody is going to take responsibility within that framework. And basically that has become like the biggest strength of democracy. We have a saying, I'm not sure if that translates into English, but in German we say, like, democracies do not lead war against each other. And that's actually true for Europe in the last 70 years, and one of the biggest, in my opinion, achievements of the European Union. But what he then says, like, is, in other words, there is no one who is like keen on declaring the emergency state, and declaring the emergency state for in Carl Schmitt's thinking is like just like that's what a leader at a point has to do, because that means like also to take it on your shoulders to abolish like, or to just at least dispense like the rule of law for a certain given amount of time. And I think like if you look into the refugee crisis, like many of like sympathizers of the AfD, they would just like criticize Merkel for like the lack of leadership therein. So the mood changed in Germany when like Merkel gave her first TV interview after the refugee crisis, and then she was like saying some stuff about the borders and can you still protect borders in the 21st century. So, and then the public mood changed totally against her policies, because people then in the polls expressed like she's not gonna like protect our borders. So basically a lack of leadership. And that's also something that you hear in the criticism about democracy. It's not talking about us like white Americans feel like disenfranchised, and this is why like leader types like Putin or Trump are so highly regarded in these movements, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. There was a hand here, and then over to this gentleman here.
Thank you both. I have a question for Tobias. So you say that churches can play this vaccination role, or you propose this argument, and I think this makes a lot of sense. So we know that there are a lot of authors who have written on the this idea that old cleavage structures can have this effect of a protective shield. So there's like Krisi and Bornschnee and Riedken have written on this. But this only works if these old cleavage structures are still in place. But now that fewer people go to church, to what extent, and we know that these cleavages are eroding, to what extent can the church still be this protective shield or this immunization? And then what other institutions could take up that role if it's not the church?
Yeah, so I mean, it obviously depends. With the churches, you will only get so many people. Like this is not this is to save liberal democracy. If the church just say something, right-wing populism won't be an issue anymore. I still think that it's actually quite interesting to see that this, even if a lot of the vaccination effect, yes, goes primarily amongst those who go to church, but it seems to also extend to a lot of those in between us who are like cultural Christians, non-practicing Christians, which are still quite sizable. And it is actually quite interesting that even in countries as secular as Britain or in Germany, I just read a study that I think even though church attendance has gone down, as Alex mentioned, and people don't really want to go, like, don't identify with the church, the recognition of the church as something positive, as a moral authority, is relatively stable. I mean, it is going down, but it's still, if you compare people going to church, which I think amongst Lutherans in Germany is now around like 3 or 4%, I think in this country it's around 1%, to those saying that the church still has a certain moral authority, I think that's more on the like 50-60% at the moment. So that may actually play a role and just also take the weaponization of religion out of the equation, because you would then still have right-wing populists, but they may not be able to use the idea of Christendom as a cultural thing to the same extent. I mean, because the churches have basically fought with the AfD in Germany doesn't mean that the AfD has gotten significantly fewer voters, but what it does mean is that the AfD is increasingly less perceived as a potential Christian party, and that an entire potential electorate is increasingly closed to that and has evolved into a different direction. I think this is like a role churches can play in many societies. I mean, in the end, they can only do so much. And then it's just the question of what is the particular narrative right-wing populists may be using, and then who else, and then we just have to think who else not in society should have authority about that, and then they could debunk a lot of things. If these things aren't used in the right way. I mean, I think a lot of churches do it actually quite cleverly. They say, well, if you actually take church positions on right-wing populists, well, then we will say you're great. But if you say you're Christian and then say, well, we are in favor of, we are against abortion, but mainly because our German women don't have enough children, and there are too many foreigners, and then the German race will be diluted, and the church says, well, that's for the wrong reasons. And criticizing. And I think these things are actually could have significant roles there. Over here.
Yeah, and this is almost covered or touched upon by the first question and Tobias at the end. But I'd like to know the position of the panel on basically, if you think all of these people are actually wrong, like there are like obviously billions of people, all other countries, and if you look back at the West itself, maybe 50 or 60 years ago, you know, identity was basically pretty much the centerpiece of politics, even here. So do you think that all of these people are somehow, you know, pathological, or is it just different?
This is for me or
Well,
for
Both of them.
Well, no, I think this has been like the patterns of history with everything that comes along, like, or the regular, you know, episodes of war. And because if you have this us versus them rhetoric, it needs to be also in the Kennedy sense, you create like a pressure within the entity, and at some point it has to just somehow explode. And that's the same mechanism if you go to, according to Kennedy, to a football game, where like the goal and everybody's just like, you know, it's just discarding like its energy. And in religious terms, you would say if you receive communion, that just helps you on the way to heaven, because that's the big boom if you are in a religious context. So I guess like the big achievement that, in my opinion, that we made like in the last 50, 70 years is just like to establish an understanding or a platform or a public sphere where we can address like global issues without getting a rampage over race and religion and stuff, because I think that's clearly also like a distinguisher from the period before, like Harvard man Steven Pinker goes on writing also like Hans Rosling, like the famous guy from the TED Talks, like the Swedish doctor. He's the same kind of like on the same line. They say like the world has gotten much better in the last 70 years. So there's all the numbers, child mortality, poverty, it's all like going up. And I would say it has something to do with like at least partly getting rid of like prerogatives of race and religion. And I mean, because that's basically one of the features that distinguish the times from before 45 to now, which in my opinion doesn't mean like that's an atheist's claim to like say like we don't need religion, whatever. I would actually never go that far. I'm a lousy Catholic, so that's just like, that doesn't fly for heaven and all. But like I'm just saying, the real achievement is like that we created a public sphere in which we could talk without like cultural superior prerogatives. And I think that's basically like the public sphere of the last 70 years, which we should try to keep and prevent from disappearing.
Yeah, maybe on that, and like in general agree, but maybe to push a tiny bit in that direction, or against that direction, is that yes, we used to like identity was there all the time, and it's actually quite interesting if you think, for instance, about the foundation of the European Union. The only reason why they didn't put in when they wrote the European Union, this is our identity. The only reason why they didn't put in is a Christian thing. It was because of course this is, and the same is true when the Americans actually wrote the Constitution about the separation of church and state. That was still like, obviously this is still an American country. It was just like assumed, and I think what we are observing at the moment is that we are like liberalism. It used to be that liberalism was then somewhat intertwined with these cultural identities. They were still there, and that our idea of liberalism has become to an extent more universalist, and gotten rid, as you say, a lot of the negative racial or religious prejudice. But it also became maybe a tiny bit sanitized on the way, and that it became so universalist that it's very hard for many people to identify with that, because there's been purged to an extent of those traditional identities such as religion, culture, etc. And I think it may be worth thinking, and this is just a thought, to maybe distinguish between inherited identities that are more or less harmful. So to think about, well, it's very good that we don't think about our identity as race anymore, because that's we don't really want to have that, but it may still be worth to think of our identity as local identities, because they may be a bit less harmful than the racial claims. Or to say, well, in the American perception of religion, that it's just that there's no state religion, but religion in general is a positive and accepted form of identity. Doesn't mean that you have to embrace it, but it's in there, and it's a good part of the liberal society and of liberalism. And that liberalism doesn't necessarily mean you have to get rid of all the other forms of identity that have been there around, maybe just of the really harmful ones.
Well, like just two remarks. so the homogeneity of European societies in particular, it plays a role now in the confrontation with because the Italians were all Catholics and the Swedes were all Protestants. The Germans had one half Protestant, the other one and this was like the game for 500 years or 400 years, if you will. And now, so this is why I think European societies in particular now have to struggle with this, with the notion or the fact basically that they are religiously and culturally more diverse than they used to be for hundreds of years. So, but on the other hand, to say Europe is a Christian continent, okay, that's lovely because here's all the chapels and churches, so that's true. But on the other hand, it's also what a distinguisher may this be in a world where the majority of Christians live in the Americas. So if you say we are Christians, that's okay. We have a Christian heritage. I've been the last person who denies that. I love organ music and even songs and all that. That's all fun and fine. But it's not just really that's just not working to create our identity nowadays, where Christians are everywhere. And that goes the same for the Muslims as well. The crisis of let's say Sunni Arab Islam is also because the majority of Muslims today don't live in the Arab world anymore. So I would always be careful with these. Because what I just said, this process of dehomogenizing, if that's the word, dehomogenizierung, I don't know how that would be Yeah, so it's a global phenomenon. So to go back to the identities we had hundreds of years ago, or 100 years ago, or even 60 years ago, wouldn't just help us to sincerely describe what happens nowadays.
Thank you. Other questions?
So my question may be a little bit out of context. So we talked about the decline of Occidentalism, Occident. What do you think about this with Orientalism? Orientalism. Yeah, you can only answer if you have something to say.
No, what would you mean? You think if there's a similar thing happening in the what we called the Orient back then, or in the Arab world?
Do you think the relation, between the decline of Occident with, with the rising or a change of Orientalism?
If I understand it correctly, and if you look into what we perceive as the Muslim world, I'd say you have a similar struggle, or another form of struggle, with modernity and what comes with it. And I'd say it's also a product of what I described about this age of identity, where we are all connected and we know each other, and that's questioning ourselves. So if I'm today a Muslim in Nigeria, I learn how a Muslim in Malaysia lives, and that may give me questions about the nature of me being Muslim. And I guess, not all of it, but some of that, what we now see, the Muslim world being on fire from Nigeria to Pakistan, has to do with that you can just simultaneously realize the different ways of being a Muslim. And there is scholars saying this is the last thing of Islam before it crashes like Western Christendom did. Others say no, that's at the beginning of a new era. So you have lots of people trying to make sense out of it, but I guess what we describe as modernity, which the Arab Muslim world has been exposed to for 200 something years now. This is the same, or it's a similar sort of thing that now happens to a formerly more or less closed regional identities, that as Tobias framed it, now just being out in the open on a global stage, and that I think creates at least some of the extent that we see in troubling the Muslims in all parts of the Muslim world.
Can I say that I think that the Orient, so to speak, the Middle East, India, China, they're all quite different to each other. And the role of religion is very different within each one. You've got the particular circumstances of Islam, IS and so forth going on. In South Asia and India, you can't divorce the troubles that Muslims are having in India from Pakistan. So it's intimately connected to what is India's greatest enemy. In China, suddenly the lid's been lifted, and you have 300 million Chinese suddenly becoming religious. And from the Chinese government's perspective, the role of Taoism, Christianity, Buddhism, etc., is perhaps to serve the Chinese state and perhaps further Chinese nationalism, but nevertheless for individual worshippers, becoming very much part of their identity. And so I think modernity is playing out quite differently, and religion is playing out quite differently in these regions.
I mean, the idea in modernity and in secularism and enlightenment was like you give people schools and food and and that also means like medical care and whatever, and like as further they go, as less religious they will be, and basically that has not panned out. I guess like what the German philosopher Habermas calls like the dialectic of enlightenment is basically like there is no automatism in history at all. It's just like you solve a question and a problem, and then you have new questions coming along with it. So like enlightenment is obviously a process, and one of the outcomes now is that that identity or religion as part of identity has not been foretold like a few hundred years as an outcome of enlightenment and modernization, but nowadays it is.
Any other questions? Philip?
One of the words I didn't hear mentioned in the talk, thank you again for your talk, it was very useful, I've made a lot of notes, is the whole idea of the role of eschatology and the vision of what you want for the future in terms of a better world, or something better for our, the whole idea that there is a hope for the future. And I think the Enlightenment had its own kind of eschatology, some idea of progress that was going to produce a better world. Now we know that didn't work out as people had hoped or dreamed it would be. And in the back of that, I think a lot of the right-wing populism that I see do have some vision. I don't know if it's articulated, but this idea that, maybe I'm asking the question, do right-wing populism have a kind of eschatology? Do they want, I know like some Christian groups have this view that if things get worse, it would bring Christ back, or some kind of return of Christ idea of eschatology, but also the other idea of the Muslim idea that we want to create the role of Islam in the world that would make the world better. So I just wanted to hear any comments about right-wing populism and eschatology.
It is actually quite interesting if you think about that. There are obviously people like, for instance, Steve Bannon, who very much seems like a secularized form of millennialism, that he says, well, everything has to break down and we have to basically burn the entire place before we rebuild it in a proper way. And you also see the phenomenon, so this is like what I talked about was right-wing populism, use of religion in a way of like taking parts of religion and using it as a cultural identifier. There is also what a couple of scholars have described as the theologization of politics through right-wing populism, that they basically go into what you're describing, a spiritual vacuum as a result of the decline of both religion and secular ideologies, and that they then go in there basically from the population becomes the people, which is something almost like divine. And then the territory becomes the sacred heartland, and to speak in these things. And the interesting thing is, it sounds to me much rather than a new form of eschatology, much rather than a revival of maybe 19th century nationalism, where the people is this sacred thing. So I think there are religious aspects within right-wing populism, especially in their rhetoric, and I do think they profit from the fact what again Habermas talked about, the profanization of society, and a spiritual vacuum or something. But it's very hard to then really define, so to speak, the telos of these right-wing populist movements. Like, what would a perfect world look like? It's very hard, and then there's also the question between the difference. Maybe some people like Steve Bannon actually have their own, probably slightly special idea of what that would work like, but it makes sense. But I would doubt that the large proportion of people who voted for him would necessarily share or even really understand what the likes of Steve Bannon are actually thinking in this respect, that they may have very, very different ideas of what the point of right-wing populism is.
I have also two remarks, especially the Bannon case shows us there is a legacy in eschatology, if you will, in this us versus stemming. Like in the 20s, when people advocated the Vatican to support fascism, it was like because there's an enemy in the East, which is communism, and it's godless, and it's gonna destroy the church. So that helped like to make the church more inclined towards fascism as a bulwark against like the godlessness of communism. And Bannon, in this famous Vatican speech, which you can find on the internet, he was invited by this right-wing Cardinal Burke. He would re-emphasize on that by saying, talking about the hordes in front of Europe's gates, which today is not the communists but the Muslims, who also will put an end to Christian life on the continent, which is a very old narrative anyways. So you have this sort of eschatology. It even creates a legacy. And the second thing, because eschatology lives by, there's secular eschatology, which means like all the salvation comes within time and space and whatever. But again, Elias Canetti in his book on Crowd and Power, he said, that's in the 60s, he said Europeans have lost their faith in the afterlife, and this makes the mobilization of Christianity impossible. So, and I think that's actually a fair assessment even 50 years ago. And you can find culturally Christians in Germany, England, and I include myself here too, but if you then go deeper and ask about the dogma, maybe people become a little more indifferent because they don't know. But if you go into the very deep question of religion, which is afterlife kind of stuff, you will find Planck, that's something also an eschatology in that sense. It's just not very attractive to many Europeans, I'd gather.
Sam, this will be the final question there.
Thanks. So, if one were to claim, for example, that Europe consists of Christian nations or America is a Christian nation, so I think that is contested and that is controversial. But if I were to claim, I would say that Europe consists of Western nations and America is a Western nation. Now, I think that is uncontroversial. So I'm just wondering the gap between the two, right? Saying that something is a Western nation and saying that this country is a Christian nation. Then how could we describe what is the West without collapsing into the Christian heritage? So the West is definitely not a geographical reference, right? Because Australia and New Zealand also claims to be Western culture and Western nations. It doesn't refer to a geographical region. So what is the West that will not just collapse into its Christian heritage?
That's a very good question. Because that's it's not only that I work on, but it's just really essential. Before the Berlin Wall came down, West meant being against the East. So we were all united in Western Europe and the United States through this common enemy, if you will. And also due to the history, the American facets of Westerners, which is consumer capitalism and whatnot, that has been on the forefront. It was very culturally dominant. So now you have, but actually, and as a matter of fact, the debates in the 19th century about what is the West had an axis between Paris, London, and the United States. There has been debates in Russia in the 19th century, which back then was perceived as a northern power. It was not an eastern power before the dichotomy of communism versus free world. So Russia was a northern power with some tendencies to be by principle a Western force, if you want. So I think now actually when we all talk about values in the refugee crisis, the Germans would maybe refer to Immanuel Kant, whereas Brits would refer to David Hume, and the French would refer to the Christian Occident more because they are Catholic or more Catholic nation by tradition, if you want. So now we have so many Western sort of people using West having always an overlap, and also West is it's a lifestyle. I lived in Taiwan the last year, and there's Western elements to it. And now this is also liberal democracy, but there are no Christians, 5%. So also what we define classically as West has become an international practice, which is not related to, which can be adopted. The thing that what I think that Xi Jinping in China has against Taiwan is basically he's walking around in the world saying, democracy is not working for Han Chinese because Confucius and our race, and then you have 24 Taiwanese just playing liberal democracy quite well. It's also the same, Muslims can also live in a democracy. There is no religion or no ethnic heritage that would prevent you genetically from being open to different opinions. So I think this has become a global practice, if you will, and has also as much as Plato's thoughts have gone westwards, they also went eastwards. So this is another layer of complexity if you want to define what the West is nowadays.
Yeah, and maybe on this, like, it's really hard to define the West because the very essence of what we often today perceive as Westerners is also universalism, which can be traced back to Christian traditions because like a missionary religion, but then also Enlightenment, etc., etc. But part of the core of what we perceive to be Western is universalism, and that by definition can't, like, in theory can include everyone. And therefore can't really be narrowed down to like this particular area. So I think the idea of a practice may be a way to get there, but I don't think we can really define, especially now that religion is on the decline and that also things like Enlightenment or rationalism are questioned when we say we are in a post-fact world. It's really hard to really say, well, this is something everyone in the West believes in. So I think just very, very tough to do that. Maybe, I mean, this is like just to small kind of anecdote. The title in our of our talk, The Decline of the Occident, is actually taken from a book from Oswald Spengler, who published this book in 1918, The Decline of the West, of the Occident, and he basically said that, I mean, this is 100 years ago, but he basically said that we are in the final stages of the decline of the West, because civilizations go from a first religiousness, where it's clearly defined, to the prevalence of rationalism for quite a while. And then rationalism turns against itself as the elites become more relativist. And then there's a second religious revolt of the people against the elites, which then ends in Caesareanism, which is the last stage of civilization before its downfall. So if one is very, very pessimistic, one could say, well, maybe this is what is happening. What is encouraging, I think, is that he said that 100 years ago and thought the same ways 100 years ago, and so far civilization seems still to somewhat exist. So,
Well, the whole tragedy of your question lies in this book, like in a nutshell. The German title is The Decline of the Occident, das Abendland, but it has been translated in English as The Decline of the West. So you just see, because as a European, I would say, like, Europe, the Occident, is something different than the whole concept of the West, but you see it already in this title, how you translated it, that there is like confusion about the true meaning of like our, like, whatever Western, Occidental, whatever you will call it, heritage, or how to name our culture.
Well, on that bright spot of civilization still existing, I'm afraid we're out of time for this event. We'll cap it there. But thanks to all of you for your questions. Thanks to our speakers for very ably responding to these questions and helping us think through a really complex, politically charged subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.